time, the Golden Age and all that it implied gradually vanished away, and in the place of the kindly rulership of Jupiter, the solar system passed to the keeping of Mars, or Oz, the god of war. And at some time remote conflict did arise in the world. And with the conflict of things, there were great changes. This conflict was partly due to the Promethean episode, in which men gaining a certain fire within themselves, of which Mars is a symbol, suddenly revolted against the gods and set up the tyranny of their own in the world. And in this tyranny they began to struggle one with the other for the advantages of their own causes. And we find in several different mythologies how war and sorrow and misery so increased upon the earth, how men so departed from truth and principle in the ruthless exploitation of their own ambitions, that finally that God sent tempests and deluges and oblivions and combustions and swept away the world that had failed to keep the peace. Out of the reign of Mars then came the peculiar situation that we find in ancient astronomy. For in this arrangement, the sun is placed next in an orbit. So the world passed to the keeping of Helios, the sun god, the Apollo. And in this is implied that the world passed to the keeping of a light, of a refulgence, of a beauty. For with the rising of the solar orbit in the ancient philosophy, the world became inwardly and outwardly illumined. It was then that the visible sun, as we know it in the sky, actually came into existence as a condition or a quality of light. Then it was also that its great symbol, the light of mind, or the light of reason, came. Then it was that man was some way strangely divided from his pre-Adamite kind. It was then that some mysterious creature which had this humanity always locked within it suddenly revealed something of its human estate. The eyes of the mind were opened, and the eyes of light began to contemplate a universe by means of the light of intelligence. Then in the course of time, out of this dawning individuality, this rise of the sense of selfness, there came another phenomena, and that was the rulership passed to the next orbit, that of Venus. And in the orbit of Venus we have the world's tremendous unfoldment, first in the emotional pressures of life, and secondly in the flowering of great arts, the arriving of beauty as a force or power in the imagination of creation. Thus artistry, creative self-expression, the urge to reveal or release the soul through advancements of all kinds of creativity emerged. And there was a second cycle of war, for in this case Athena, which is closely related to this pattern, is accredited with having given to the world ornament and the art of weaving, two widely diversified things. Also in this came the mysteries of ambition and the strange psychic passions and animal instincts which have later come to be so powerful. After this, the next orbit of the planets arrived in its proper and due sequence, and we had the orbit of Mercury, and the world was turned over to the rule of the intellect. Here mind began to take over all other considerations. The light of reason passed into darkness, and in its place was the dim candle flicker of thought, of intelligence as we know it. Everything then became a matter of formulas, of terms and words, With the coming of the orbit of Mercury, Cadmus is said to have invented the alphabets and all the writings and readings of mankind. The sciences came into being, and all other forms of exact knowledge. And Mercury became the symbol of formal education, the rise of philosophic systems, the motion of man also gradually and inevitably towards the sciences. In the ancient concepts of things, the next orbit was given to the moon. And the moon was held as having a true orbit, which we do not recognize today. But in the old geocentric system, the reason for the moon's place is very obvious and important. The moon became the symbol of illusion and delusion. It also became an emblem of self-deceit. Perhaps, however, more originally and in line with the older concepts of things, the moon was associated with the power of precipitating lives from an invisible to a visible state. The moon, therefore, was the gateway of generations. The moon provided the mysterious humid element by means of which souls in a free state were drawn toward body. And it was because of the power of the moon and the mysterious cycles which it exercises, and its still recognized influence on the cycles of fecundity, that the moon is said to have provided the gateway for invisible souls to enter into the earth. Therefore, in that time and under those conditions, not only did the embodiments come, but the embodied creatures ruled by the moon were ruled by a reflected light and not a true light. And the government of the moon was strangely the government of physical instinct based upon the procreative pressure in living things. All of these together, the seven, then caused their energies and powers to center upon the common receptacle of such energies and powers, and that was the earth. And because men thought in terms of their own habitation and of the effect of all these mysteries upon themselves, having no way to interpret, except to interpret, as these various influences affected their own existence, we know that man, psychologically, can only live in a geocentric system of existence, or perhaps we might call it an egocentric or a human-centered system, because this is all he knows. This is the only experience which he is capable of having. In any event, into the open cup of the earth, poured all these influences. And these influences not only sent their rays and forces downward, but each ray carried a seed power within itself. And all the planets of the solar system above were reflected under the surface of the earth to become orders of minerals, orders of gems, orders of energy and magnetism, orders of substances and chemicals. They also gradually sprang out of the earth again as orders of plants and animals and living creatures. And everywhere within creatures, these seven again repeated themselves in the rising of sensory perceptions, in the release of powers, in the building of organisms, each of which was a septenary structure in itself. And from this we have the whole great pattern of septenaries, which, due to the divisions within them, also provided the law of octaves. Actually, having thus brought everything to bear into the great center of things, we find, as Empedocles points out, that actually in the last we have man. Man himself, in whom the universe and the solar system are epitomized. Man who has received his body from the planets, his soul from the stars. We have man himself, in whose nature all of these forces are symbolically or actually present. We find man who's suffering from the disease of one planet is cured by the remedy provided by a planet of contrary quality. Here we find also that the sensory perceptions are tied to the stars, the fates of men to the motions of heavenly bodies. Thus this whole strange, wonderful system seemed to come into existence. And in so doing, it established also the relations of worship. It showed the structures of religions, how the faiths of men were engendered and sustained. For each planet set up its own religion in its own time in the cycles of the world. Some of these religions have continued, others have vanished away, but where they have vanished in form, their energies have continued in new appearances. We have in all of these different patterns the endless operation of a law of similars, of all things sympathetically affecting other things of the same qualities, all things by their natures and forms based upon one great design, the Platonic archetype that was so well sensed and appreciated by Leonardo da Vinci. Architecture, all the different branches of human life, arise of specializations within these areas. From these same planets and their mysteries, the Hindus developed his doctrine of chakras and spiritual centers, came to find the keys to his great systems of yoga and Vedanta. From the same systems also came all the elaborate imagery of Tibet, Mongolia, and Korea and China and Japan. All these patterns work together, forming out of the solar system one design, infinitely repeating itself in gradually descending magnitudes, but always consistent by what the ancients called a process of concatenation, in which things descend in likeness from themselves, decreasing in size, perhaps increasing in number, but always the mystery of one, if solved, will reveal all the others. Also, by this same law of mysteries, only one life is carried throughout this entire structure. And were the smallest atom or the tiniest structure in nature to actually cease, then the entire universe would fail on its foundation. And this ancient concept seems to have a little bearing on our modern researches in nuclear fission. Nuclear fission is only a manifestation of the incredible energy potential that is locked within the smallest divisions or units of substance. This reveals perhaps more rapidly and clearly than any other way that the entire energy of space is captured in each of the seeds which are sown in space, and that the reason why the fission of the atom is possible is because all growth is finally a fission of atoms. It is a gradual release of cosmic energy until the smallest, by normal and legitimate growth, unfolding all of its potentials far beyond anything conceivable in a nuclear fission today, that each seed contains within itself the potential of a total cosmos. This would be quite consistent with the old position and may yet have some fascination for modern thinkers. As the universe and the solar systems that make it up moves in its endless march across the great fields of space, another interesting point is presented, namely that growth has to be according to this ladder of John, or this ladder of Muhammad. Evolution is the motion again from the center to the circumference. When all the great energies in the field set aside for the solar system were condensed, drawn together, or centered in the form of the physical sun, this sun became a vast compression of the energy that had otherwise been diversified over a large area. The moment this compression was perfected or completed, the visible or luminous body of the sun appeared. But from that moment on, when involution or the compression process moving toward the center it was changed to the great evolutionary cycle, at that moment the sun's rays began to move out again over the area which had previously been deprived, so that the release of the sun back again to the original state of diffused, equally distributed energy is part of the reason for this great radiance that we ascribe to the solar activity. In other words, the sun, moving back over the area which has been deprived, is bringing to life or nourishing all these units which have to slumber or rest until the sun's energy is reversed by the great tide of cosmic process. The ancients thought this all out. Perhaps they were ambitious, perhaps they were audacious, but in any event they had a big idea. They had an idea that certainly transcends our common interpretation of things. In the development of this same concept, the sun became more and more identified with the essential characteristics of man himself. Just as the solar system had its sun, so every man must have his sun, must have his light. And one of the three great centers in man must correspond to this light. In the old system, the analogies were variously made according to the abilities of the people. The three suns in the human body were represented by the three principal centers in man: the heart, the mind, and the reproductive focus. The third, or visible sun, was associated with the reproductive system. The second, or psychic sun, was associated with the brain. And the great central sun, the spiritual sun, was associated with the heart. The heart was therefore the true giver of life, and sustained the other two suns by its own spiritual energy. Some of the alchemists had another arrangement, however, in which they showed the heart as a triple sun, much following the Gnostic and earlier beliefs, making the heart again a kind of gyroscopic center in which the three suns had their actual abode, and the mental focus in the brain and the physical focus in the reproductive system were reflexes of this central sun. This returns also in your northern Buddhistic school, where the spiritual sun, Amida, is represented by the two reflexes which are essential expressions, Kannan and Seishi, one representing the psychic life of the individual and the other representing the generative power indicated by the thunderbolt carried by Seishi. In any event, a triad was set up, and in this triad, one energy within man was divided, as in the solar system, to sustain and nourish three different types of growth, or different types of energy. Actually, according to the old Hindus, there is another interesting point, namely that the solar system, with all this elaborate process going on in it, and these processes are innumerable and are not in conflict with each other, that the solar system truly represents a great womb, a great place for the prenatal development of sons. Therefore, that actually, to use an old Hindu statement, only the sun itself is born. The planets are embryos. These embryos actually signify unborn sons. Therefore, each one of them is attached to the solar center by an invisible magnetic umbilicus, which enters each of the planets itself magnetically at the North Pole and provides the luminance or energy necessary to maintain the planet. Each of the planets, therefore, is in a prenatal state, nursed by the sun, and will remain in this state until it is born, at which time its magnetic field will reverse in the same way as the circulation of the blood in the embryo. In this also, the fact that the planets are not born is carried on as a thought further into the Hindu cosmogony. In the magnetic fields of the planets, 5 magnetic fields are recognized or identified. These magnetic fields surround each one of the planets. But by means of a little trick in mathematics, these magnetic fields have been increased in number to 7 by dividing 2 of them in half. That is, into an upper and lower level, as in the case in man of the emotional nature, which is described as the higher and lower emotions, and the mental nature described as the higher and lower mind. But actually this is something of a subterfuge, because the complete septenary is only symbolically implied. In the ancient system, each planet has 5 magnetic fields, the sun providing the 6th and 7th, so that actually there are only 5 separate bodies for planets, magnetic or invisible bodies. And the 6th and 7th bodies have not been individualized, and they remain part of the magnetic field of the sun. It is when the 6th and 7th body have been identified or individualized that the planet is actually born and becomes a sun. Until then, it depends for its life and nutrition upon the solar center. All this is also referred to and discussed in the great symbol systems of antiquity. And for instance, we know that in Buddhism, the 5 Dhyana Buddhas are recognized, the 5 great spiritual meditating lords, but the 6th and 7th, though known to exist esoterically, are not listed or are not revealed. These represent the 2 powers of life in an evolving planet that have yet to be individualized from the solar body. Man also has the power of a septenary of sensation, 7 senses, but only 5 of these have been individualized, the other 2 belonging to the psychic field of the planet itself. Thus, everywhere in the present state of mankind, all septenaries consist of 5 operating and 2 suspended powers. This is because they all go back to the solar system with its 5 individualized and 2 unindividualized essences. What is the ultimate power of a solar system to be understood as consisting of? In the ancient times, Plato, many others, referred to the solar system as the divine animal. The Chinese have a very good idea of this. The solar system is a being. The solar system is alive. And the solar system is the peculiar deity ruling over everything that exists within it. Therefore, the basic nature of a religion must be associated to the nature of the creation evolving in a solar system. If we get to other planets, as we may someday, it's not at all impossible, we are going to find, however, that intuitively and psychically we have accord with all beings on other planets. I think this idea of a malignant race somewhere in space waiting to conquer the earth is in the world of science fiction. Actually, man's sixth and seventh sensory perception must be held in common with the equivalent on all other planets of the solar system. Every planet may develop a kind of life which has sensory manifestations of its own, and they may be entirely different from ours. These beings may have the equivalent of 5 sensory perceptions. If they are comparatively young, they may not have individualized as many to the same degree that we have. If they are more advanced, they will have individualized them perhaps past anything we have achieved. But these sensory perceptions, such as we call sight, hearing, taste, touch, and smell, these perceptions, or their equivalents, according to the conditions of the different planetary environments, will be developed individually by the creatures inhabiting these. As a result, they may have achieved a great nobility, or they may have failed to achieve a high culture. Perhaps they will not even be visible to us, not having the kind of bodies that we know or can capture in our vibratory sensory perceptions. But the 2 higher faculties, which all beings within a solar system must possess to complete the septenary, the 2 higher faculties are still unindividualized. Therefore, they still belong to the solar body. And because they belong to the solar body, they are a reservoir of common insight. And any creature extending its consciousness above the 5th sensory perception will have some common communion with any other creature that does the same thing, because these sensory perceptions are not divided. Therefore, if we wish to assume that the 6th sensory perception is a kind of psychic clairvoyance in qualities, extending beyond our present knowledge, perhaps a conscious apperception or experience of causations, then any creature that reaches this peculiar degree or level of intuitive insight will share it with all other creatures possessing the same insight. In other words, with any creature that passes beyond the 5th sensory perception. Now, the same thing is true of religions. For actually, religions arise in 2 ways. In substance and essence, they arise from the solar energy itself. By interpretation, they arise from the individualization of man. And this is a point that has also been confused in Buddhism by non-believers. They do not realize the double causation of things, namely the things arising in their own natures, and these same things taking form and unfolding through the mental limitations of human beings. So in the ascent of religions to a certain degree, through what you might term the nominal religious beliefs of man, you are going to have different faiths. But these different faiths are going to move closer together. But when you get to mysticism, you find that it is a faith in common of all men. And when you get beyond that to the highest levels of esotericism, you find there is no conceivable difference in religious conviction. Thus we have in all these different areas we have 5 differentiated elements following the old order of earth, fire, air, water, and ether. We also have 5 differentiated elements recognized in China. They are slightly different from ours, but constitute the same gamut. Then we have 2 unrecognized basic elements. And these 2 also constitute, finally, the highest environmental factors holding forms, bodies, and structures together. They are the great cohesives. We have 5 recognized ether factors, so-called hypothetical, but actually real. We also have 2 higher forms of etheric integrations, which bind things together rather than binding together the parts of single things. Thus, in the solar system, we have a very elaborate and very useful purpose in the unfoldment and perfection of life. It has been noted from the beginning also that the precessions of planets, the motions of seasons, and all the other phenomena that we know have together constituted religious ritual. We know that the High Mass is a solar ritual. We know that practically every part of the religious symbolism of mankind relates to the parts of the solar system and their rhythms and relations with each other. It was only in comparatively a short time ago, however, a few centuries, that Kepler made one of his most vital discoveries. The solar system being like an alchemical retort, containing within itself the power of the sun, which has only the power to manifest certain principles from within itself, gradually becomes the environment of an infinite diversity. The Pythagoreans declared that this diversity was included within unity, and unity itself was never divided, the unity representing the wall pass-knot that completely envelops the solar system as the shell of an egg or as the surface of a bubble. But now comes the problem. How out of the regularity and inevitability of these processes can what we call difference come into existence? How, for example, to approach it from an Aristotelian point of view, how can that which is the same cause difference? And if we wish to point out the religious factor, that which is the same is God. Therefore, how can that which is the same become conditioned? How can deity, for example, produce the state of not deity? How can infinite good, which is deity, produce the phenomena of that which is not good? How can an eternal, benevolent God permit evil? This is an interesting and very tricky subject. But perhaps, as Kepler points out, the solar system is the secret, for within its processes we discover the laws by means of which that which is the same can be different. The answer lies, of course, in the motions of planets. Not that the motions of planets constitute in themselves this difference, but by another subtle factor which Pythagoras also pointed out, namely that the power of planets is not in their bodies but in their intervals, that it is the space between them that determines their power, not the bodies themselves. So here we have, for example, 7 powers represented in ancient times by the planetary deities. In the astrotheology of the ancients, these 7 powers were fixed. They were manifestations of the power of the solar Logos. There was nothing that they possessed that was different from what he possessed. He was not deficient in anything that they could contribute. They remained as they were, each a manifestation of one phase of the divine nature. None could be better or worse than their natural endowment. None could be more or less than that which was their own nature. Therefore, even though they moved and fluttered in space or went whirling around their orbits forever, they could cause, by the more common thinking, no difference, because it made no difference how they moved or where they moved. Their natures did not change. And if their natures did not change, then in the common thinking of man, there could be no difference or separateness set up by them. But what happened, as Kepler found, was that things, the natures of which do not change, produce difference by their relationships with each other. The things themselves do not change, but the angles of incidence of energy motion and the directions of motions do change. Therefore, if two of these bodies came into a relationship of a 90-degree angle of the meeting of their rays, this relationship